definitely we're not living in the world described by 1984. If you're in North Korea, you might have slightly different views.
Welcome to Classic Amateurs. I'm Norman, and I'm here with Raz.
It's good to have you back, so I'm super, super pumped.
Do you know what we are talking about today, Raz?
2 dystopian books, 1984 by George Orwell and Brave New World by Huxley.
Happiness for all.
Aldous Huxley. His name was as weird as his book. So, great stuff. I will be representing Brave New World side, and you will be representing 1984, but we'll have a bit of exchange as we go along. All
and
right?
Which dystopia is better?
Which dystopia is better or
if
more
you
terrifying?
were to choose your dystopia, which one would you prefer?
Well, is the question which one is better or which one is worse?
Implicitly.
Yeah, that's an issue. Look, I think I can already call winner based on that question, because Brave New World is a dystopia that is often described as a dictatorship everyone
always happy,
while 1984 is obviously very much the opposite. That's why it is so easy to contrast the two. Brave New World is basically a social engineering dictatorship. The idea there is that we are in the future. I think it's played around 2500. It's based on a governmental system that grows babies and test tubes, and as they grow up, they actually social engineer them to accept wherever they are in the social hierarchy, as well as be always happy.
Always happy.
Don't aspire for anything other than they are already assigned to, and some other stuff. If you grow up yourself in the world of Brave New World, you are essentially going to face a day of sex, drugs,
soma break,
menial work, and happiness. There's very little thing in Brave New World that doesn't kind of come across as a utopia, which is, I think, a very common idea I have. Like, a lot of what is described is happiness, right? There are few people that don't like that. Few people that want to strive for more than what they are assigned to by the government. And these people can venture out. Some of them that misbehave a bit more. They are
to be sent to Iceland.
Imagine people who live in Iceland now what they might think. Or if they don't grow up according to the government's needs, they are essentially going to be sent to the Savage, a reservation where people still live according to the old world's rules. The main conflict of the book is essentially this guy and this lady who travels to the Savage reservation just to experience something more than just sex, drugs, and fun. And they encounter some very unfortunate realities and how they cope with it. That's the elevator pitch of Brave New World. What about 1984?
1984, I guess, is a book written in 1948, obviously with a nod to the future, inverted period where Stalin was still the winner, right, of the Second World War.
Victory has been achieved.
And I guess the UK and the Allies had decided to slowly kind of break away from them, but there's clearly a difference in kind of values. It was obvious. But it's more about a person against a system or a society. But it's this kind of man that has no identity and lives in this repressive regime. 1984, I guess, has some similarities to what you were mentioning about Brave New World, in the sense of it's also very much a kind of a top-down led society, but it's a lot more dystopian than what you were describing. And I think it's about this man who loses part of his identity, slowly kind of degenerate, loses his humanity in this repressive regime that is really modeled after the Stalinist Nazi regimes. And basically, he's kind of this government employee, and he's part of the system. He's part of this rewriting of history, right, that is very, very specific to kind of propaganda-led regimes, right? He is basically part of creating this persona of this leader, the leader, and it kind of the novel introduces the idea of Big Brother, which we have seen recurrently in popular culture, the all-knowing kind of godlike supreme leader. I think the story revolves mostly around his attempt at humanity through a relationship with this woman, and that provides some form of enjoyment. Basically, that only link to humanity is effectively broken down by this top-down authoritarian system gradually to the point of tragedy. And I think it's basically a cautionary tale, effectively, of what even a liberal, democratic regime can go through if left unattended.
Sure. So talking about women, which is my second favorite topic after classic books. I think sex is probably one of the big differences between the two books. While 1984 is very anti-sex, I think there's this whole, like, women walking around with contraceptives on their waistband, and everything is against, the party is very much against reproduction. Brave New World is encouraging it. They have the idea that everyone belongs to everyone, which is essentially just says there are no relationships and there are no long-term monogamistic connections between people. Instead, you always have to shift and switch partners. You always have to take part of like larger orgies and stuff, which already shows you how much more sympathetic the Brave New World is.
When was it written? Just for historical context, when were these ideas, which are quite controversial?
1930s.
It's quite interesting, right? It's not
1930s.
Something in the 70s during the great sexual revolution or anything
Sexual
like that,
revolution.
Right? Yeah, it's really much more...
So I think the key reason why it was written as it was written, Huxley himself was a massive drug addict. Well, he was a big big advocate for experimenting with mushrooms and mushroom-like.
And he has his book, right? The Doors of Perception, which effectively influenced the band The Doors to pick up that name, where I think he documents his experiences with drugs. We're not making any endorsement.
That's possible. And just to be clear, when I say mushrooms, I don't mean shiitake mushrooms or some sort of cup mushrooms. It's something much more insidious. Anyway, so I think, and that kind of leads to the next thing, the drugs, which I think is a reasonably unique part of Brave New World. They have a drug called Soma, which is just opium. It's basically opium or heroin, if you may. And everyone's constantly high. Everyone's given Soma so that they don't resist the system, right? Once you are in the savage reservation, you don't have that drug available, and you suddenly start to feel the pain that is giving you all the anxieties and everything.
So they're going through some form of withdrawal as well as they go in that area.
It's possible. It is possible. It doesn't go that much into detail. The book is mostly just focused on the journey of this man and his companion and how he encounters the savages and then what the savage encounters in the world. But among many things, it creates a massive divide between the quote-unquote old world and the new world, so much that someone among the savages cannot live in the brave new world anymore and vice versa. I think in 1984, it's just kind of escalates from an authoritarian state to the same authoritarian state, but even more surveillance and torture and all that jazz, right?
The 1984 introduces some topics that were probably very much top of mind at the time. You know, the idea of totalitarianism, which we still see, right, in regimes across the world. And we have this added element of kind of mass surveillance and repressive regimes, right, which was, at the time, the technology just wasn't that developed. I mean, we had the phones, and surely that was kept. But then using basically this whole apparatus to be engaged in a perpetual war where the government kind of justifies its role, to protect you. Nothing in the past exists. It's only the present. It's only the leadership. They're there because they're there to protect you. And then any attempt at dissenting, is met with by the big brother with this called kind of doublethink, I think. And, you get this thought crimes effectively. And then you get the thought police basically canceling you. But in this case, cancellation doesn't just go to the platforming. It goes to effectively kind of locking you up and subjecting you to various forms of torture and dehumanization, which I think raises some very important topics, even today's world, that I'd like to get into.
Yeah, sure. I think 1984 model is way more straightforward than Brave New World. It's an authoritarian, oppressive regime. What George Orwell did with his writing is to escalate whatever political propaganda existed back then to its maximum, right? Everything from wiretapping to doublethink, and the general propaganda machine is just an extreme version of what was available already in Stalin's Soviet Union or Hitler's Germany. And the reason why we can always relate to it quite easily is because any state intervention has that echo in the background that could lead to a much more oppressive state. Whether this is true or not, that's up for debate, right? So, and I'd argue that if you ever follow political discussions, this is literally 1984 is a very common topic, very, very common quote. 1984 is probably the most quoted book and probably the least read book compared to how many times it's quoted among people. It is fun to talk about 1984 because it's a pretty on the nose story, right? It's like, we are oppressive. You should be afraid. So it's quite obviously.
Yeah, it's like a regime on its last,
there.
on its last legs of pure terror, right? You don't really know how it got to that. I don't know if the origin story of that is really developed enough. It just shows you the consequences of allowing a regime that is anonymous and omnipresent of kind of ruling your life. And it's a call to kind of individual action, but also not really like kind of admittance that, as an individual, you're quite powerless against this. So I think one of the issues that I have with the book is that, of course, very much aware that where if you have an unaccountable authority, you're going to run into this problem of it having a sort of sense of control over you, and you have no power of influencing it unless you're kind of part of it.
It's a warning.
Yeah, and you can cherry pick some of the topics today, right?
Yeah.
Look at the internet, right? I mean, it is also implicit. It's a great tool for us to communicate, have this conversation remotely in various parts of the world as we are now. At the same time, everything that we have, we're sharing is public, and also everything that we do. So then it raises the question, where do you draw the line around your own privacy? And how much do you allow big platforms, let's say like, Google or Facebook to influence your behavior? It's just influencing it. It's not necessarily coercing you into it. All these things are still super, super relevant. And we haven't really figured them out yet.
Will we ever figure it out? It's probably an ongoing battle. Like every single platform that arises, every single year there will be a new technology or issue that we have to sit down
Twitter
to
and deplatforming, right? If you say something that is not in agreement with the community, whatever that is, the community has the right to eject you from that platform. How is that similar to kind of a social construct, or a real social group where you just don't like someone and you push them out because they have different views and they're a bit too loud? To what extent should you be allowed to do that? And especially given it's commercial entity.
In some way, it's always been like that. And even in the medieval ages, if you said something against the king or whatever the ruling class, you could have been defenestrated or spiked up through your butt, and that
by
kind of
like Impaler,
is what Vlad the Impaler, and that takes a new shape and form in terms of cancellation. Not saying it's normal or anything, I'm just saying it happened, right? I don't know if there's any lesson learned from this other than scaremongering, because now you can use 1984 to point to what the extreme will be, no matter what people are doing. And it's right, it's true. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just people jump to conclusions a bit too quickly, in my opinion.
In a way,
they exaggerate as to where a lot of these live.
I agree. I mean, definitely we're not living in the world described by 1984. If you're in North Korea, you might have slightly different views, but these are really exceptions. And maybe to the point where you might argue that society is really unsustainable to some extent. It's so unbearable to the majority of people that will most likely just collapse. Although you'd argue that Stalin still managed to maintain his reign for maybe a few decades before he died, and kind of the Soviet regime through Khrushchev reformed and acknowledged the genocides and the gulags and all that stuff slowly. That still can last for quite a long time.
There's definitely a much more straightforward way to see if we live in 1984 or not, right? But I also argue that it is a much harder to sustain system. Just like you said, it's hard to imagine the system is sustainable, considering that they are not allowing people to have sex and everything is obviously oppressive. People are obviously oppressed and sad and depressed. So this is not something that human nature can handle for very long.
We both agree that maybe neither of these are sustainable because they do lead to the dissolution of civilization to some extent, right? And even an opioid crisis as described in Brave New World, you'd argue, taken to its final conclusion, cannot be sustainable, right? We can't live on...
I'm not sure, actually. Obviously, I'm not advocating for drugs or anything, but I am not always... I don't always understand why people think Brave New World is a dystopia. That's my hot take. I think Brave New World in many ways is a utopia, right? Mm-hmm. As I said in the beginning, is a dictatorship that people want to live in, right? And it is kind of creates that, the motto that you can't free a slave who loves his chains. Mm-hmm. The idea is that Brave New World created a society where people don't really see their chains. They don't recognize that, whatever they are wearing, whatever system they are part of is not natural. They're just happy as they are. So I'm not even sure how that would fail if you consider there's a huge sacrifice they have to make to actually move on, to be free like the savages. No one wants to be part of the savage community in the book, although savages are, by and large, are free, right?
Yeah, it just reminds me of Plato's The Cave. I don't know if you read that, which seems to be modeled on that, right? The people in the cave, they just see their own reflections, and they're just afraid to walk out of the cave, effectively. They don't really understand reality on the other side there. They fear it. In this case, they actually exit, and they're more miserable than they would be otherwise.
Applying Brave New World to today's society is difficult as well, because you could look at anything that's good and be like, wow, this is just manipulation. This is just people trying to get me comfortable and not get away from it, right?
What makes these books classics is that there's still elements of that are innately kind of human and really intrinsic to all societies. And I wanted to kind of, if we were to synthesize that, what do you think those would be from Brave New World that still have a relevance to today's world? And it's just stuff that we might need to be aware of or thoughtful of or concerned about.
Yeah, drugs are bad, I guess. Other than that, I think it's relatable, right? There are elements in every part of Brave New Worlds that you can relate to today's society, whether that's relationships or being comfortable in your own skin. Ultimately, I think the lesson is that you have to suffer to an extent, or you have to struggle to an extent to grow and be happy. Too much comfort will make you as depressed as too much oppression, right? Nothing is good enough. I guess we are just human, and humans are never happy.
Yeah, no. And we spoke, just to add to that point around pursuing an opioid type of satisfaction and assuming happiness equals kind of pleasure. I think because that's what opioids do, is they provide, as opposed to dopamine, which provides drive. I think that's a very important lesson, and you cannot build this. I don't think you can build a society on pleasure alone. I think we become extremely miserable when we're addicted to opioids, and also just pure consumption of pleasure. I think we need a society built on some form of dopamine, right, that has an element of delayed gratification, drive towards goals. Otherwise, I don't think it can function.
We live in a society.
We as humans will never be fully satisfied by an anonymous institution, right? We should always challenge these institutions and make sure they're in tune with our kind of our human needs, which will always be changing, individual, and always maybe at conflict with the higher order authorities. We're special.
You are special.
You're special.
This podcast is special.
Do you want to close it? Do you want to close it any other way? I don't know.
Happiness for all is happiness for each.